Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a holiday that lasted just a little bit too long. So now I've completely forgot how to do these intros. I mean, this is going to be a Khora guide, so welcome to Bondage Club, otherwise known as Warframe, I guess. I don't know, this intro's terrible. Welcome back, boys and squirrels and everything in between. Yes, I know, I've been gone for more than a week. So by natural tendencies of the internet, that must have meant I died. But no, I've merely taken some time to do some soul searching, and I've come back the wiser man. And in so doing, to bring you a remastered Khora guide. Yay! So, Khora, the frame that at the sheer mention of her name will make anyone who's slightly into whips and chains shiver with delight. Ooh. But thankfully, this is not DE's attempt at turning Warframe into a dating simulator, as much as I'm sure some of us would actually enjoy spending a night with Khora. Khora is actually one of the most sought-after frames for a lot of people, for many different reasons that we're about to start talking about. Now, whether it's for her unbelievable utility and support through efficient crowd control, utilizing her Strangle Dome, which can dangle enemies around like a piñata, ready to be beaten, and in so doing, also then utilizing her Augment in that notion can also then spawn additional loot. And then to being able to pump out ridiculous damage through her whip, which then scales based on melee weapons and other variables, which we'll talk about later. This, in turn, creates one of the funnest damage output abilities in the game, and probably one of the more fun playstyles that can encourage not only unbelievable damage, but unbelievable support and utility, as well as also something that's actually quite pleasing for the eye as well. In fact, there is so much to Khora that I'm going to be splitting this video into two segments. This first one is going into the fundamentals that you'll need to know to get a decent understanding of her basics, how her playstyles work, and how you can mod her in an effective way that will give you a good understanding of her initially. And then, in a second video that we do at a later date, we're going to go into a deep dive. And I kid you not, with this deep dive, we're going to show you how you can deal 1,000,000 damage per hit. With Khora, most players will rely on the simple act of using her cat to maintain and boost them in their missions, and also through their allies as well, and then relying on range and duration to allow the Strangle Dome to crowd control and deal significant slash damage to enemies in a large area. And due to the way these abilities function, you don't even really need that much power strength on her to get the most out of them. This allows for a very versatile playstyle and also very versatile modding semantics. The real thing to understand here is that Khora is a great all-round frame, whether it comes from having a very complete and very fun kit, to the fact that you can basically spam your abilities willy-nilly and not really see a negative effect. If you're spamming your 1 and your 4, you're helping your team, you're killing enemies. If you're using your 2 or your 3, you'll then be setting up kills, you'll be helping your team, and you have a lot of adjustability to personal preference of playstyle. That, combining, as I mentioned, with a very versatile modding ideal, allows you to basically mod her any which way and have some element of power coming out of her. Realistically, one of the only negatives I can say for Khora is how you get her. Her components, unfortunately, come from Sanctuary Onslaught. Thankfully, it's only the basic one, but it does mean if you get to wave 8 and her piece doesn't drop, well, you gotta go through all of that again. And seeing as 2 of her pieces drop from rotation C, which is 8 waves in, it almost feels like they did this to make us farm an unnecessary amount to keep us playing longer than would be considered normal and respectful of our time investment. DE? Alright, so now we can look at Khora's abilities. Now, her passive isn't exactly a passive, so to say, as it's something that's just kind of part of her kit. Khora's passive is that she gets a bonus cat on top of your regularly equipped pet. That's right, for all you cat lovers out there, Khora has a passive feline following her around called the Makari. This can then be modded separately, like a regular pet could, and should this pet be killed, it will then respawn next to Khora 45 seconds later, really giving a meaning to cats having 9 lives. Additionally, while your Makari is alive, you gain a 1.15 times movement speed, which is nice. Furthermore, the Venari comes with a passive trait that can be turned off and on via Khora's third ability, and we'll talk more about that in a moment, as there are 3 separate abilities that you can cycle through. Khora's first ability is probably her strongest in terms of the physical impact it can have, and although at first glance Whipclaw may seem pretty weak on its surface level, it deals 300 damage to enemies in a 5-meter radius with a range of 10 meters. And really, that doesn't seem like much, but when we take into consideration that it has an innate 200% crit modifier with a 25% crit chance and 20% status chance, and then add in the explosive radius increases with more range you mod for, and then we add in the damage increase with not only your power strength, but you can also then scale your damage from your melee combo modifier and the mods you have equipped on your melee weapon. Although it is worth mentioning, not all mods you equip will affect your Whipclaw, but the majority of the baseline affecting mods will. For the sake of not drowning you with numbers, I'll leave the finer details about how you get this unbelievable level of power for the deep dive we do, as this is kind of where most of her complexity comes from, about understanding the synergy of a stat stick and everything therein. But let it be known that Khora is not only a crowd control beast, she's not only a beast tamer, but a raw DPS beast as well. However, the augment for this is pretty much a must if you're doing generalized content, and especially also helps extenuate the idea that you don't need to mod for much power strength, due to how you scale your damage with modding and the aforementioned stat sticks. So, this then frees up for more modding space for your augments and everything else Khora uses. Really, Khora is probably one of the only frames where it's viable to, and encouraged in fact, to use multiple augments at once. Accumulating Whipclaw will build a stack of bonus damage for every 3 enemies you hit at once, stacking up to 35%, which then scales based on power strength. So this is why, although you don't want to go heavy-handed with power strength, you want at least 100% power strength so you can scale up to around 300% bonus damage. Ensnare is Khora's 2, and acts more like a direct crowd control than anything else. Targeting an enemy within 30 meters, said target will become trapped in bondage metal wire. Yes, for 15 seconds. While trapped, the enemy will then start grabbing other enemies with metal wire that walk within 10 meters of the initial target, and apply the same trapped debuff to them. This is getting a little bit steamy if I do say so myself. However, it's worth keeping in mind that only the initial target will propagate the additional crowd control chains. But you can have multiple instances of the ensnare up at once. So if there's more than one target and a larger area you want to ensnare, you can have the initial ensnare up on more than one target. The idea here is that you're going to use your ensnare to set up big old chains of attacks for your enemy, to also then take enemies out of the fight so that they're not getting in your way. This is then also compounded by the fact that any enemy affected by ensnare will take an additional 200% damage from your Whipclaw and Venari. So there's a nice little bit of synergy therein as well. So pretty good for setting up bigger enemies to knock them down, as it were. The range of the initial cast and the grab range is then affected by your ability range. The duration of the ensnare and the delay before the ensnare affects others are affected by duration. The idea here is that more duration equals longer stun and less delay before CCing the targets around you. However, you don't necessarily need that much duration in the first place to make this effective, as the ensnare is pretty damn powerful, but should be more so used for the idea of setting up bigger damage more than anything else, as you have another ability we'll talk about in a moment, which is there for most of your potent CC. Khora's 3 doesn't necessarily have a name, it's just Venari, which is your pet. Tapping this ability will mark enemies for your Venari to focus down. Depending on the trait you have allocated that we talked about earlier, and also that what we're going to be talking about in a moment, will depend what the Venari will do. See this as a little bit of an Ash-like ability with Blade Storm, where you mark enemies for death. Only this time it's Death by Kitty! Khora's 3 isn't really just a single ability, but is the embodiment of what the Venari is good for and how it helps you. Holding your 3 allows you to toggle between 3 different settings for your Venari, and depending on which is active will depend on what passive benefits your Venari will give you. These postures and passives will then affect the enemies differently and are as the following. Attack mode will do what it says on the tin and cause your Venari to be very aggressive, like a cat that's been given catnip, and uses a trait called Snare, which will chain an enemy... Wait, the cats are using chains too? I didn't realize this was a furry convention. Nonetheless, once snared, the Venari will deal 5 hits to the snared enemy, each hitting for 350 slash damage per hit. And it's just something you use to let your pet go away and do what it needs to do for itself, whilst dealing some moderate crowd control. Protect will turn the Venari defensive. She will basically defend you and the allies around you. She will use an ability called Tail Whip, which will cause the kitty cat to knock down a single enemy that's close by, permanently disarming them should they survive, and once they've recovered from their little trip. This is pretty useful, but probably the one you're going to use the least out of her different rotatable abilities. And then the final rotatable ability is Heal. Heal will cause all allies to complain at you when they die by standing in fire. Sorry, WoW reference. In all seriousness, Heal will do what it says on the tin. The Venari will cast something called Revitalize, which will cause the Venari to chase after players once they're below 90% health. It will chase after the player with the lowest health and heal them for 50 health per second, which can be affected by power strength, and ideally makes this a good little team sustainability should you be taking additional damage that you don't want to. But in essence, it's probably the second most useful of the rotatable abilities. And as if to compound all of this, the augment for your Venari is called Venari Bodyguard. Venari Bodyguard then allows Khora to have a cheat death, where in place of you dying, like so, your Venari will die instead. However, for this, you will then have a 150-second respawn time on your Venari instead of the 45-second normal respawn time. But this can then be counted, because for every enemy you kill, it reduces this time by 4 seconds. I would not suggest using this in most situations, as you have more than enough crowd control and damage with Khora to not really die in most situations. But if you want a little bit of self-sustain and something that can help you in an oh shit situation, then this can be nice. And as I mentioned earlier, Khora is one of those frames where you have a lot of room to put augments on her, so this can be nice if you're trying to get used to how Khora plays. The fourth and final ability for Khora is probably her most known out of her arsenal, and is the one that you recognize most when you hear the word Khora, which is called Strangledome. Beyond turning an area into an enemy body decorated party zone, it is in fact one of the stronger crowd controls out there with some of the most usefulness to it. A Strangledome will cover an area of initially 5 meters and be able to drag enemies from 10 meters distance away, causing them to ragdoll within its confines. These enemies are then inert until the CC wears off, similar to that of Vauban's Bastille or Hydroid's Tentacle Swarm. The only difference is that the Strangledome then deals 250 damage per second, and dealing 200% bonus damage based on the weapons you have equipped at the time. So not only does this CC like an absolute beast, but it's just a great for its damage too. And really, it does a great job of warding off areas for your allies and also for the utility of what its augment comes with. When we combine this with its augment Pilfering Strangledome, we then have an ability which sees probably some of the most use of any ability in the game. And it kind of encourages a method that I mentioned earlier, where you basically want to have Pilfering Strangledome on you at all times. Because you have the room for all these augments, why not have constant loot duplication whilst you're crowd controlling an area? The thing with Strangledome is that it's not the most range effective, but it is probably one of the strongest in terms of the damage and the crowd control it does at the same time. Pilfering Strangledome, much like Hydra's Pilfering Swarm, grants a 65% chance for enemies held captive by Strangledome to drop additional loot. And this then synergizes and stacks with things like Necros' Desecration. So if you're looking for a frame to add into a farming team, Khora is definitely one, and definitely becomes one of the more useful frames to bring to a farming team. And now, very quickly, the build section. I'm not going to spend as much time on this build section just because, as I mentioned earlier, Khora's builds are immensely versatile, so play to your preference here. These builds that I show you are just what have worked for me, and I feel as though if you're going to use them, make sure you innovate them to your personal preference of playstyle as well. This first build is about the control, the area of effect, the ability of putting Strangled Dome down and being able to control an area and hopefully get additional loot. Now, the main thing here is the range. We don't need much power strength because we're focusing on control and duration. So we have Cunning Drift, Overextended, Reach, and Stretch for as much range as physically possible. We then have Continuity for that duration to make sure our Strangled Dome stays up for a bit longer. We then have survivability mods in the form of adaptation. Adaptation is obviously not something you're going to get easily. If you have anything else, just slap that in there instead. Vitality, Steel Fiber. You don't need that much survivability of Khora because you're controlling an entire area, so enemies shouldn't hit you that much in the first place. But if you don't have the augment for Pilfering Strangled Dome and you just want the crowd control, you can also replace the augment with anything. You could put some power strength in there. You could put some survivability in there. Really, the only thing you need to worry about with Strangled Dome is range and duration. Flow and Streamline are quite nice so that you can cast more, but Flow could also then be swapped out for something else as well. Streamline is just kind of what you need there so that you can cast more on the go. And now for a bit more of a preference kind of playstyle. This is the build that will focus on your damage, your accumulating Whip Claw, and your general usage of your Whip Claw. Now keep in mind that although these builds don't have much different between them, this is kind of the good thing about Khora. No matter how you build her, most of her abilities are still going to be very powerful. Even with minor duration and less range, you're still going to get good use out of all of her other abilities. So with this build, we've sacrificed duration in the place of a bit more power strength in the form of Intensify. If you don't have Umbral Intensify, don't worry, just use regular Intensify. And a bit more efficiency so we can start spamming our Whip Claw. Now, we've gone with Fleeting Expertise in place of Streamline because we want less duration so that we can spam more diligently because of that extra efficiency we have. So we still have the same range in the form of Cunning Drift, Augur Reach, Stretch, and Overextended, but we've just lost that duration in place of a bit more power strength. With accumulating Whip Claw, you want to try and get at least 100% power strength. That will then take you to 350% bonus damage from your accumulating Whip Claw. And if you want something that's really simple and helps you get to grips with the fundamentals, this beginner build will help you with that. The only mod in here that you might struggle getting initially is Reach, but that comes from Plains of Eidolon. This build is all the fundamental mods with Vitality, Steel Fiber being your survivability, a bit more of a focus towards range with Reach and Stretch. Then you've got Continuity for the duration, Streamline for the efficiency, Flow for the extra energy to complement that, and then Intensify for the power strength. From here, you can kind of just build up to what you want, but this beginner's build will handily help anyone who's just picked up Khora for the first time. And that's the video, ladies and gentlemen. Hopefully it's been to your liking. Hopefully the improved version of this guy will be absolutely dance on the original. I mean, that old one's kind of embarrassing looking back at it now. But as always, guys, please make sure you check out my Twitter. Please make sure you subscribe, like this video like you all have been doing, definitely, haven't you? And do keep your eyes open for the next video, because the next one is going to be the deep dive, where we go into detail about the stat stick. We go into detail about where all this extra power is going to come from. Right now, though, I do believe this video will cover all the elements you will ever need to know about Khora and how to initially get into her. So hopefully it's been useful. If you feel like dropping by and joining our fellow Tenno here and recording these videos to help be victims for me, then by all means drop by the Twitch channel. We do stream pretty much daily, and of course there's then the Twitter as well that you can use to keep up to date with everything going on in the world of the Top Hatters. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see all of you Top Hatters in the next video. Ta-ra!